our program to bring you this important message.
This is not a drill. This is an emergency.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent.
I'm Tommy Salmons. This is Year Zero.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
John Kiriakou is a former CIA analyst and counterterrorism expert. He left the CIA in 2004 after he blew the whistle on the illegal torture programs that were being carried out in the Middle East. He's since written some books, and he also writes articles. I believe I saw him published in Consortium a time or two. I've heard him, and you've probably heard him on the Scott Horton Show. He's also made appearances on cable news networks, and he has his own radio show. Since he blew the whistle, he's been a defender of freedom in such an important way. He's always out there getting his hands dirty, getting involved in the stories, understanding the narrative from a different point of view, and being able to reveal the thinking of the intelligence services. He's definitely a hero to the idea of liberty, if nothing else. So enjoy my interview with John Kiriakou. Well, I'm here with John Kiriakou. I'd asked John to come on because I wanted to get into some of the ideas of the intelligence agencies versus political or elected officials. And what really made me think about this is I think it was you, John, that had mentioned on Unity for Jay. I had heard you. I thought it was you that came up with it. You said used a term. You called it the permanent government, talking about the intelligence agencies. Was that you?
Right. Yeah, that was me.
Yeah, I thought as much, and I was like, that was interesting because everybody seems like they're trying to think of analogize, with shadow government or deep state. But I thought that was a great way of saying it. What's the best way to describe how the internal workings of this permanent government work?
Well, first of all, there really is a deep state. You don't have to call it a deep state. You can call it a lot of different things. The federal bureaucracy, the state. It is an unelected permanent government. It's always been this way. Sometimes it wields more power than at other times. And it's something that I think most Americans have never really paid much attention to, at least until recently, really until the beginning of the Trump administration. You've got these bureaucrats, for example, who are not elected by anybody. Once they're part of the federal bureaucracy, they're there for life. And I've made this point on the major networks as well, too, that you've got leaders at the CIA who transcend presidential administrations. They are there for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, and there's no accountability. They just are always there, and they know they can outweight presidents, and they do all the time. And so if they're working for a president they don't like, they can what I call slow roll a president. For example, they may not begin that particularly dangerous operation that they otherwise would. They just ignore presidential instruction, which I used to see all the time. They just do whatever they want, knowing that in 4 years or 8 years, this president's going to move on and another person's going to be president, and they're still going to be there. Part of the problem, the main part of the problem, I believe, the reason that we find ourselves in this situation is that there is absolutely inadequate government oversight. We have these oversight committees on Capitol Hill that really are not overseeing anything. Really, they're just cheerleaders for the agencies and departments that they're supposed to be overseeing.
Right.
So where in the 1970s or the 1980s, you would get pushback from the House and Senate intelligence committees. Now you have members of the intelligence committees just cheering on the CIA and NSA and the FBI and other organizations. There's just no oversight at all. There's no one to say no. There's no adult in the room.
Right. Yeah. I'm always, and I hear Scott Horton bring it up all the time, but I always think of that
oh, yes.
Bill Hicks clip where he was a comedian, and he has this bit to where he says when somebody's elected, what they do is they take them into a dark room, a dark smoke-filled room. They show them a different perspective of the Kennedy assassination that no one else has ever seen before. Then they look them in the eye and say, "Any questions?" And that's just how they can handle it, And so it's obviously it's hyperbolic, but it's the same. It's the type of you see it where it's almost like it feels like no matter. Tom Woods has a good saying. He says, "No matter who you elect, you always get John McCain." And that's how it feels.
Right.
Like our foreign policy is a mess.
Without the hyperbole, I can tell you exactly how this works out. What happens is that you get a president-elect who has little or no experience in foreign affairs or intelligence. Mm-hmm. And the day after the election, he's entitled to a PDB briefing. That's the President's Daily Brief.
Right.
That's the most highly classified document produced by the CIA. Mm-hmm. And that's the document that's used to brief the president every day. Mm-hmm. So the day after the election, the CIA pulls this new president into a room and they say, "Mr. President, we want to show you the most important secrets that we have in the whole world. We want to show you the cool things that we're doing all over the world." And as soon as that president-elect sees his first black border report or blue border report, something that's classified at multiple levels above top secret,
right,
they know that they've sucked him in. They know that they've recruited him.
Yeah.
And then they've made him one of the guys. And for the rest of his term, he's going to be one of the guys, and he's going to do as he's told. Mm-hmm. Now, Donald Trump is different because he doesn't have a history of doing as he was told. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't really have an interest, I think, in intelligence and foreign affairs. There were other presidents, too, that were not sucked into this. Jimmy Carter, for example,
right,
was not sucked into it. Bill Clinton was another one. Bill Clinton just didn't like or trust the CIA, and they didn't like or trust him. And he refused to allow himself to be recruited. But most presidents are recruited.
Well, one of the things I've been looking at, and I mean, you talk about the recruiting, but you go back to the first George Bush. He didn't need to be recruited. Like he was already in.
They created him.
Yeah, exactly, right. Exactly. But I look at the history of these intelligence agencies and the FBI, and I don't really, I guess FBI is intelligence, but it's more homeland. Yeah. So I don't really lump it in, but it's one of the 3-letter agencies. And it seems to me, even though it's hard to find any information on the history of the NSA, but it does seem to me when you look at Hoover and you look at Allen Dulles, all right, it seems to me like the number one thing that they were interested in was garnering as much power centrally in their organization in order to solidify some sort of legacy for them, and to the country be damned if they had to burn it all down to solidify their power within their agency. Is that how it kind of works? Is it kind of like a power struggle whenever you're within these agencies?
Without a doubt. The CIA almost was never created. with the 1947 National Security Act. J. Edgar Hoover, who had been the head of the FBI since the 1920s, if you can imagine, all the way until his death in 1972.
Right.
J. Edgar Hoover hated the idea of a CIA, and he was actively opposed to it in 1947. Finally, Harry Truman invited him to the White House, and Truman convinced Hoover that the CIA would be a division of the FBI. And that's the only reason why Hoover withdrew his objection to it. So with passage of the National Security Act of 1947, the CIA was created, lo and behold, as an independent agency. Hoover was furious and never forgave Truman for it. But it created this counterbalance to the FBI, and it started a power struggle between the FBI and the CIA that lasted until the September 11th attacks.
Do you think when you look at this power struggle, and I know the power struggle exists between the agencies and interagency struggles, basically for jurisdiction, is
Yes.
what I can gather. But
Yes.
whenever it comes to elected officials and the agency, when they do actually butt heads, and what I'm thinking of particularly, and we can get into this some because I've done a couple of episodes on Assange, but what I'm thinking of in particularly is how Trump was campaigning, I love WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is doing such great stuff. And don't get me wrong, I understand Donald Trump's going to kiss the ass of anybody who's giving him some kind of advantage in life or giving him some kind of props. But at the same time, the way he turned his back on Julian Assange as soon as he was arrested, was that like, do you think that was a little bird from one of the intelligence agencies saying, look, this is our fight, and this has been going on a lot longer than you've been thinking about politics. You need to back off on this one.
Without a doubt. And I think that came directly from Mike Pompeo. As soon as Pompeo said that WikiLeaks was a hostile non-state intelligence service, that was the end of it for Assange. I really believed for a while that Assange would either get a fair shake in the event that he were extradited to the United States, or the Trump administration would just lose interest and walk away.
Right.
At least that's what the president sort of hinted at during the course of the campaign. Mm-hmm. And of course, that just didn't happen. You have two true believers in Mike Pompeo and Jeff Sessions, and with the appointments of the two of them, that was the end of any hope for Assange.
Yeah. And what have we been looking at? I kind of lost track of what was going on with Assange, just being busy. What are we looking at now? I know the last I heard he was sentenced to a year in Britain.
Yep.
And then he was given
50 weeks.
Okay.
There was a maximum of 52. Mm-hmm. He's in Belmarsh Prison, which is a maximum security penitentiary outside of London. Mm-hmm. They did that to him just to screw him, essentially. Mm-hmm. And then the U.S., of course, has formally requested extradition. The extradition hearing is going to be held on the 18th of June, and it will probably have to be delayed because Julian has appealed the extradition request to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, there's a precedent there where the European Court of Human Rights has denied U.S. extradition requests to at least 4 other people. Okay. For several reasons. One, because the U.S. still practices the death penalty. And 2, because of the way the U.S. practices solitary confinement. The United Nations has deemed the U.S. practice of solitary confinement as a form of torture. And so people have successfully argued, these are people in the UK, have successfully argued that, hey, you can't send me to the United States because they're going to torture me, even if they promise they won't torture me. Mm-hmm. The nature of their system is one that's based on torture. And that's been a winning argument in the European Court of Human Rights. I talked to Julian's lawyers 2 weeks ago, and they said that they believe that they can bottle that up, that extradition request, in the European Court of Human Rights for as long as 5 years. Mm. And I think that's why the Swedes began their reinvestigation of the sexual assault charges against Julian last week, because they know that the likelihood is that Julian will not be extradited to the U.S.
Right. And isn't the process in Sweden a little bit swifter and a little bit more lenient as far as extradition
Yes.
goes? Okay. So
is.
it'll be harder to tie it up in court in Sweden.
Much harder.
Yeah.
It'll be much harder to tie it up in court. And remember, Sweden's not a part of the European Union.
Right.
So they don't have to abide by the EU Court of Human Rights or by any other European Union regulation. All they have to do is follow the bilateral extradition agreement between their country and the United States.
Yeah.
And if the U.S. is able to check the boxes, the likelihood is that the Swedes will extradite him. So the big fight then, I think, is going to be about 45 weeks from now when Julian gets out of Belmarsh. And the Brits aren't going to want to just let him walk the streets of London.
Right.
They're going to want to extradite him to Sweden.
Yeah.
And then let the Swedes deal with the United States.
Yeah, well, and that makes sense because I mean, if he's set free, he's a free man. He can go wherever he wants. You know.
That's it.
So yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, how are they going to stop him? You know, moving in next door to Edward Snowden. You know.
Yeah,
So,
that's right.
And
That's
who
right.
could blame him? You know, in all honesty.
Yeah, I wouldn't blame him.
You know, after 7 years locked up in an embassy and the day you get out is the day you get thrown in like one of the heaviest prisons in all of Britain. I don't know if I would blame him. So
He's had a rough time of it. And, you know, the judge, of course, blamed him for his situation. But he knew that the fix was in 7 years ago.
yeah.
And so here he was, barricaded in that embassy, no exposure to sunlight. His body was in need of vitamin D. The guy's got rickets, or at least he had rickets for a little while.
Right.
Mentally, he's been under great strain because he was essentially in solitary confinement for the last 7 years. And now we learn that the Ecuadorian government was plotting against him for the last year.
Yeah.
They were negotiating a trade agreement with the United States in which he was the pawn to be traded.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not had an easy time of it. That's
Yeah.
for sure.
What did they end up getting out of that? Like $10 billion in loans or something like that?
Oh yeah, it's
Some
huge.
insane
It's
amount of
huge.
money.
And the day after he was expelled from the embassy, the Wall Street Journal had an article that was entitled "Ecuador is open for business."
Yeah.
So the fix was in.
Yeah. Surprise. So when I want to move a little bit into the Trump Russia stuff, and I want to talk about like the idea that it has not been let go, and just the continuous like hammering on that subject.
Yeah.
And I know you've talked about
Yep.
it and you've written about it a little bit. What do you make of what is happening? Is this all just the Democrats wanting to impeach Trump, or is this the deep state, the permanent government continuously putting their thumb on him because he won't do exactly what they want him to do?
You know, honestly, I think it's a combination of the two. I think that the Democrats have smelled blood in the water for a long time. And I think that they've actually been successful in the mainstream media intimating that there has been something untoward without having to actually back it up with facts. Right? So the Mueller team finally concluded that there was no collusion. That ought to have been the end of it. But it's not the end of it. You know, you turn on Rachel Maddow any night, and she says either Russia, the Russians, or Moscow 100 times over the course of her show. On my own radio show, we actually counted it one night, and she said Russia, the Russians, or Moscow 96 times. And this was after Mueller determined that there was no collusion. So yeah, I think in part it's political. I think that the Democrats think this is a winning strategy, whether it is or not. They think that it is, and I think that this is a way for the deep state to weaken him and to push him out. And believe me, I'm no great fan of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
It's just that what I am seeing is not backed up by evidence.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. At some point in time, we have to worry about truth. Like at some point in time.
That's it.
And so I don't like Trump. I don't like the idea of a president at all, you know. So I look at it and I'm just kind of like, all right, well, he's there. This is the system we live in, and this is how it works. And what has he actually done? You know, like if you really, the way I look at it, and again, I'm going to refer back to Scott Horton because he says this all the time. If you really wanted to go and impeach Donald Trump, the crimes are there. There are war crimes. You look at what's going on in Yemen.
Exactly.
You look at what's going on in Somalia, this, that, and the other. But the problem with that is now they have to backtrack and they have to go after, you know, Obama. And they don't want to go after Obama.
Exactly right. You know, one of my attorneys, who's also a dear friend of mine, is one of the country's leading constitutional scholars. Mm-hmm. And when Donald Trump said, before he was inaugurated, that he would bring back waterboarding and a hell of a lot worse, those were his words,
mm-hmm.
my attorney said that in his lifetime, he had never seen a president or president-elect promise to commit an impeachable act. You know, just come right out and promise to commit an impeachable act, and that is to bring back a torture program. But you're exactly right. These unapproved wars are also impeachable acts.
Right.
Every time he bombs Syria or Somalia or Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever, Libya, wherever, that's a crime. That's an impeachable act. There are only 3 ways that you can actually bomb places legally. That is, if that country has attacked you first. Mm-hmm. The second is if you have been invited by the country to bomb them and to help them by bombing them, say there's an insurgency or something.
Right, yeah.
And third is with the approval of the UN Security Council. And none of those things have happened.
Right. So
every time we bomb one of these countries, that is an international war crime. It's an impeachable act.
Right. Right. And that's one thing I did want to ask you about is when it comes to the foreign policy. I know that in the past, and probably still going on today, and you know, obviously we're not going to be able to prove it for 30 years because there will be no documents released for 30 years. But in the past, you look at 1953 in Iran, you look down in Chile, you look at all these different countries that the CIA was heavily involved in the foreign policy and in overthrowing these regimes and creating these revolts and these revolutions. How much are they involved in actually drafting the policy? Does that all come out of the Pentagon? Are they all working with the Pentagon? Like, how does that work?
They work with the Pentagon. There's actually an office at the CIA. The name of the office is classified, so I'm not going to say it. But there's an office at the CIA that handles that kind of coordination. Mm-hmm. So you hear all the time that the Pentagon, for example, has off-the-shelf plans, military plans for virtually every country in the world, right? Just in case you need to invade, Guyana, for example. Mm-hmm. They've got a plan that they came up with years ago, just sitting there on the shelf. They can dust it off and update it and then enact it. But that's not always the case. Sometimes those plans come from the CIA, and they begin as proposed covert action programs. And then from the CIA, they go to the Justice Department to make sure they're legal, from there to the NSC for political approval, and then from the NSC to the Pentagon to have the military planners actually implement them. Mm-hmm. So not always do those plans begin at the Pentagon. Sometimes they begin at the CIA.
Yeah, because it really feels like, it's always felt like to me like the CIA, and you hear the intelligence, like Clapper and Brennan and these guys up at the high echelon, they're pushing this interventionist foreign policy, and they're trying to push us into war.
Oh, yes.
And they're cheering it on. And so it always seemed to me like they had a bigger hand in it than it was ever played up. And obviously nobody likes to talk about all the regime changes and this, that, and the other, but just in the drafting of the policy, it always felt like they had more involvement in that, and that they knew more about it.
And listen, these guys know. yeah, these guys know that they're not innocent. Do you think it's a coincidence, for example, that George Tenet has never traveled overseas since leaving the CIA directorship? Or that John Brennan or James Clapper never travel overseas? Mike Hayden, they
Right.
never go anywhere because
Right.
they know that there's a likelihood that they're going to be arrested and charged with crimes against humanity or war crimes. Why take the chance?
Well,
They know what they've done.
It's truly amazing that we go through this entire process all the time, and we watch these guys get up in front of Congress and lie and lie and lie, and we know they're lying. It comes out later that they're lying, and nothing ever happens to them. And it's you can't help but think that there's files, like just stacks and stacks of blackmail files, like all over the CIA headquarters, because it makes no sense that there's absolutely zero retaliation ever taken.
Ever. I think that those files, though, are kept at the FBI. They've been doing it for so many decades. We're coming up on a century that they've been blackmailing American policymakers.
Truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The fix is in from the beginning.
Right. Well, and I told a guy a while back when he was talking about how big of a scumbag Comey was. And I'm like, really? Did you think that over the years that the FBI had any inkling to fulfill any legacy other than the legacy of J. Edgar Hoover? And if Comey is doing the exact same thing that Hoover was doing back then, what do you think's been happening in the interim? You know, just because it's exposed now doesn't mean that this is some outlier, you know?
Absolutely right.
So
Absolutely right. You know, just because Hoover died doesn't mean that the FBI stopped doing those kinds of things.
Right.
You know, I've always believed that COINTELPRO didn't end when it was exposed.
Oh, really?
If anything, it expanded.
Yeah, I could actually see that.
I've always believed that. It's not. I don't think it's an accident, for example, that local police departments have infiltrated various groups on Facebook, for example, just to find out where the next demonstration is, who the leaders are, who they should be targeting. They learned all that from the FBI.
Yeah, well, I mean, and even when there were the protests in Seattle, you know, they infiltrated the protesters, and they were the ones who started all the violence. Were all police. I mean, that's right. That was ridiculous.
They were provocateurs.
And well,
absolutely right.
Well, and like you just mentioned that you thought COINTELPRO had expanded. One of the things that I've always thought of was this rumor, and I'm putting that in the quotations, of Operation Mockingbird, with the CIA working with the media, and then you look and they just outright hire Brennan, and it's like, okay, so is this even an operation anymore, or is just this the norm?
I think Ken Delanian's an even worse example, going in the opposite direction. Here's Ken Delanian, who's the chief national security correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC, formerly the national security guy at the Los Angeles Times. Yeah. And through a Freedom of Information Act done by Jason Leopold of BuzzFeed, Jason was able to find emails where Ken Delanian had sent his articles for clearance to the CIA before he sent them to his own editor.
Oh, I don't know how I missed this story.
This was huge. Before he sent them to his own editor, he was saying, "What do you guys think about this article? Are you okay with the language?" Like, what in the world are you doing? Do you work for the CIA? I mean, apparently he does in some fashion.
Right. And well,
so yeah, I mean, it's bad enough that John Brennan becomes a highly paid talking head at NBC, but going in the opposite direction, you have Ken Delanian clearing his articles with the CIA.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's obvious in a lot of ways. I mean, you saw this during the Bush administration, how they would just read the White House, memo, on the air. It was kind of like, okay, like, are y'all even going to hide the fact that you're just a mouthpiece, you know? And I think that's why like people like me like start podcasts or like you're on the radio. We just feel like there's no one out there honest with us anymore.
No.
You know?
No, I agree with you. You know, citizen journalism, I think, really is the way to go.
Yeah, one of the
Because people
guys
like you and I have nothing to lose.
Right, and one of the guys I watch like really closely is Tim Pool, and he does a really good job. I don't necessarily always agree with his opinions, but he does a really good job of trying to give you just straight facts. He gets down there in the middle of these riots or whatever's happening, and films it and has it on live feed on YouTube, and you can see what's going on real time, and you don't have to depend on the news to ignore it. So, you know.
Yep, agreed.
But hey, I know you got to go, man, and I really you want to plug anything before we get off here?
Oh, thanks. No, I'm not really working on anything right now. Just keep up the good work. Make sure you don't let them silence you, and keep speaking the truth.
No one's ever going to silence me, and I hope to have you back on, man. I'll talk to you later. You have a good evening.
I look forward to that. Thanks so much. Good to talk to you.
All right, Bubba.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday of getting back at you.
I was a CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. We had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.
You take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday of getting back at you.
I was a CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. We had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.